Hello everyone, today I'm going to be making recipes from the Civil War, and I thought this would be a really fun video to do because in my AP US History class we're studying the Civil War right now. In the Civil War, food was a necessity, but it didn't really taste the best since a lot of times the food had to be non-perishable. The soldiers would often get tired of the food since it was made out of pretty much the same rations. Some of the common ones were beans, salt pork, and flour and cornmeal, which I will be using. The recipes I'm going to be making are hardtack, Confederate artificial oysters, cornbread, a stew made out of beef and hardtack, as well as Lincoln cake, which is more of a Civil War era recipe, not necessarily something that soldiers would eat. But I decided to add in Lincoln cake because I wanted to have a dessert. The first recipe I'm going to be making is a recipe for hardtack, which was one of the main staples for both the Confederates and the Union. Hardtack was basically this really hard cracker, and it had a lot of different nicknames like tooth dullers and worm castles, and basically it was just this one food that everyone pretty much hated. They hated hardtack so much, so they would try to avoid eating it plain, and they would try to incorporate it into as many different recipes as possible. Hardtack was made in large factories, and then it would be shipped out into the armies, but before then it would sit in these large crates for who knows how long, probably weeks, possibly even months. And what that meant was in the summer, the hardtack would get really dried out and stale just sitting in those open crates, and then in the wintertime, the hardtack would get rained on and it would become very moldy. And I forgot to mention that I'm getting all these stories from this book called A Taste of War, and this is also where I'm getting the recipes. When I was in 8th grade, I had a really fun US history teacher, and his name was Mr. Kerwin, and he made hardtack with us. So I've made hardtack before, and I'm curious to see how it's going to turn out today. Let's head over to the kitchen to make our hardtack now. For our hardtack, we're going to need a stand mixer, and in it I have 2.5 cups of flour, as well as 1 teaspoon of salt. I'm going to turn our stand mixer on low speed, and we're going to start to mix this. And while this is mixing, we're going to gradually add in our water. Now we're kneading our dough by hand until it forms a nice smooth dough ball. Our dough is surprisingly fairly soft, and it's almost a smooth dough, so we're just going to continue to knead this until it gets nice and smooth. And our dough is looking fairly smooth, so we're just going to carefully roll this out. I just cut our dough out into a rectangle, and now I'm going to cut it into squares. And now this way, I'm just going to cut it into 3 pieces. Now we're going to use a chopstick, and we're going to place out 3 holes in each direction, like this. 1, 2, and 3. I placed all of our hardtack on our pan, and now we're going to bake it in a 400-degree oven for 30 minutes. Now that our hardtack is done baking, we're going to move on to our next recipe, which is cornbread. Our cornbread recipe is going to be really easy to make, and all we need are a few ingredients. We need 1/2 cup of yellow cornmeal, and I used coarsely ground cornmeal, as well as 1 cup of flour, a pinch of salt, 4 beaten eggs, 2 tablespoons of milk, and 3 tablespoons of melted butter. We're going to start by adding our cornmeal, flour, and salt into our bowl, and we're going to mix this until it's thoroughly combined. Now we're going to add in our eggs, and now we're just going to mix this until we have our batter. Our batter is thoroughly mixed and there's no clumps of flour, so we're going to transfer it to our skillet now. This is a cast iron skillet. I forgot to mention that our skillet is greased with butter, and now we're going to bake it in the oven for 15 minutes at 375 degrees. I just took our cornbread out of the oven, and it smells amazing. I ended up baking it for around 20 minutes since it wasn't done at 15 minutes. Now I'm going to be making Lincoln cake, which is a Civil War era recipe, and it's not necessarily something that soldiers would eat in the field. It's more like something civilians would make during the time period of the Civil War. For our recipe, we need 2 cups of sugar, 1/2 cup of softened butter, 1 cup of milk. We also need 3 cups of flour, 1 teaspoon of cream of tartar, as well as 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda, also need the zest of 1 lemon. And we also need 2 thoroughly beaten eggs. We're going to start by adding all of our dry ingredients to a bowl. And now we're going to thoroughly whisk this together. And now we're going to add the remaining wet ingredients to a large bowl. And now we're going to cream all of our wet ingredients together. The butter is still coagulated after mixing it up, so next time I recommend creaming the butter and sugar together before adding the rest of the wet ingredients. Now we're going to add in our flour, and we're going to combine this till it's thoroughly mixed up. Now I'm going to transfer our cake batter to 9x13 pan, and then I'm going to bake it in a 375-degree oven, but I'm not really sure how long to bake it since the recipe doesn't specify, so I'm just going to check on it fairly often. Our cake is now done, and I ended up baking it for around 30 minutes. Now I'm going to get started on our second to last recipe, which are the Confederate artificial oysters. This was another dish that soldiers would eat out in the field, however it was more of a treat since it uses some ingredients that weren't often available. For example, it uses eggs and butter, which were hard to find, and it also uses fresh corn. All we need is 2 cups of corn that is cut off the cob. This is just raw corn. We also need 1 well-beaten egg, 4 ounces of flour, 3 tablespoons of melted butter, and just a dash of salt and pepper. We're just going to add all of our ingredients into the bowl. Now we're just going to thoroughly mix this all together. And now we're just going to add a dash of salt and a dash of pepper. I'm going to form this into a ball before carefully flattening it. And now we're just going to carefully place down our patties. Now we're just going to go ahead and flip our fritters. I just finished frying up our artificial oysters, so I'm going to get started on our last recipe. For our Vermont beef hash, we're going to need half a pound of beef stew meat. We're also going to need 2 potatoes cut into pieces, as well as 2 cups of beef broth, and also 10 hardtack. The recipe calls for hardtack ground into fine flour, so I'm going to break it into small pieces and then use a NutriBullet to grind it into the fine flour that we need. I'm going to be working in small batches, and I'm carefully going to use my NutriBullet to pulse this into a flour. And this is the fine flour that we came out with. You can still see that there's some small chunks, but it's fine because it's going to dissolve into our hash. Now I'm just going to continue grinding our hardtack until it's done. Now I'm going to go ahead and boil our potatoes. Now that our potatoes are done, I'm going to go ahead and boil our meat. Our beef is done cooking, and I just cut it into little pieces. Now I'm going to mash the potatoes. Now I'm heating up our beef broth until this boils. Now that this is boiling, we're going to go ahead and add in our meat, as well as our potatoes. And we're going to add in our hardtack flour. And now we're just going to mix this up. Now that we have a hash-like consistency, we're going to sprinkle in salt, as well as pepper.
Many hours later.
It's finally time to dig into our Civil War meal, and I'm really curious to see how this is. I have a feeling some foods are going to be better than others. The first thing I'm going to be trying is our hardtack, and I have a feeling this is going to be my least favorite item because I feel like it's going to be really bland. And also, it's as hard as a rock, so hopefully I don't break a tooth on this. Wow, this hardtack just really has not much flavor. It kind of just tastes like flour. It's very mild, and it's also quite hard. However, it's not as hard as I thought it would be. I think it's because it's freshly baked today, so a little bit of moisture is still inside the hardtack, but I could see how if you're eating it weeks after it's being made, it would be really hard and stale. But they definitely had to have food that could last. After all, it is being shipped really far out to the battlefield. Now I'm gonna move on to our cornbread. And this, you can't really hear it. It's still hard, but it's definitely not as hard as the hardtack. I think I may have overcooked it, but let's just go for it anyways. It can't be that bad. At least it's made with cornmeal. You know, this cornbread isn't too bad. It's definitely overcooked, but the flavor isn't bad. You also have little pieces of the cornmeal to add some texture, and I think it would be pretty good with some added sugar. It's actually more realistic that this cornbread is overcooked because, for one, it's hard to make cornbread over an open fire, which is how they would make it, and also, the men never learned how to cook since women did all the cooking back in the 1800s. Now I'm going to move on to the Confederate artificial oysters, and I actually have high hopes for these because it's mostly made out of corn, and corn is just delicious. You know, these artificial oysters are pretty good. They're basically just like corn fritters. It's mostly just corn with a little bit of flour to bind it together, and I think it would be good just with a little bit more salt. And they also said to serve it with butter, but I don't really think that's necessary because that would just make it too rich. But these are actually really good. Now I'm going to move on to our Vermont beef hash, and I'm not sure how this is going to be. I feel like it might be really bland and sticky and slimy because we added all that hardtack into there as well as mashed potatoes, so I really don't have high hopes. Also, I feel like the meat is going to be kind of tough, but here it goes. You know, surprisingly, this is my favorite thing I've tried so far. There's plenty of salt in there, especially from the beef broth, and the beef itself actually has a decent amount of beef flavor, and it's not too tough or chewy either. And you really don't taste the hardtack. I think it just kind of dissolved, and then mixed into the mashed potatoes, so really it just tastes like mashed potatoes and meat, so this is actually really good. I'm really digging this now. But we can't forget dessert. It's time to try our Lincoln cake, and this isn't really anything soldiers would eat unless it was like a special treat from their family. I'm just curious to see how this is going to be. I think it's kind of questionable because there's not any salt in here, but I think the lemon zest should help. This cake is a surprising treat. I thought it might be too dry, but it's not. It's a very dense cake and it's quite sweet, and I love the fresh lemon zest in there. That's what really makes it a great cake. And I really don't notice the missing salt in there. However, I think a nice addition to make it more modern is to add a little bit of vanilla extract, and then I think this would be a pretty killer cake. Overall, I was pleasantly surprised with these Civil War foods. The hardtack and cornbread weren't great, but that's kind of what I expected, and everything else was quite surprisingly delicious. I would actually eat most of these other things, possibly even make them again. The recipes I made were from this book, A Taste for War, except for the cornbread and hardtack. I'll put links in the description down below in case you want the recipe for the cornbread or hardtack. And I'll just type out the other recipes in the description. I really hope you guys enjoyed this travel through history. I really enjoyed making these authentic Civil War recipes. Anyways, I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure if you did to give it a like, and also make sure to subscribe. And I'll see you guys in the next one.